Many people listening to this may at first wonder, what is the Sitra Achra? Therefore, to explain what the Sitra Achra Church is, I will need to explain what the Sitra Achra is before getting into all of the associated topics. With that in mind, this introduction alone may take up a few episodes, so stay tuned. Before I continue, all of my books are available in the links in the description. For listeners in the United States, the Barnes & Noble link is provided. I ask you not to use Amazon, as my titles on that site are now only being carried by third-party sellers, making them much more expensive. For anyone else around the world, please use the Lulu link. I know they charge shipping, but I will try to help you out with the book price itself being lower. And on the Lulu note, I am going to be busy updating the available books so that my entire catalog is available there. Also, if anyone is wanting to donate to this project, please note that Devoted Publishing is a for-profit company. And by clicking on the link, you will agree to the terms listed there. Or you can go subscribe at the Substack link, and if you are feeling generous, you can pay for a subscription, which will allow you to access the chat and be able to comment on posts, as well as get exclusive insider posts about current projects and other thoughts that may come to mind before releasing the next podcast. Now, what is the Sitra Achra? In Hebrew, Sitra Achra translates to other side. Other side may not sound ominous in any way, but when you take in the larger picture of what the other side is, it becomes much darker. First, there is this concept about the tree of life in the Kabbalah. Kabbalism itself was derived from various sources. The earliest source is a practice called Merkava mysticism, which was an early form of Jewish occultism that emerged post-exile in Judea. Merkava mysticism was likely around when Jesus was walking the earth as well, and still is practiced within the occult today. On that note, Kabbalism was not around when Jesus was on earth. Kabbalism was a 12th century development by Merkava mystics who were exiled from Judea by Islam during the various crusades. These Merkava mystics then took ideas out of Merkava mysticism, various forms of Gnosticism, and lastly from their Babylonian Talmud as well. The first result was the Kabbalah text, the Sefer HaBahir, and more texts and books started to emerge, the most famous of which is the Sefer HaZohar. Just to be clear, I am aware that there is disagreement about whether the Sefer HaBahir was first written or the Sefer Yetzirah was. I am not going to try and answer that question here. All I need to do is recognize that there is a disagreement about the two books in the academic community. What else we also must recognize is that the Babylonian Talmud, while finished in 500 AD or CE, the Babylonian Talmud did have many scribal updates for many years, including during and after the Crusades when Kabbalistic texts were being written. I will note the importance of this in a minute. Another thing that Christian scholars have done is try to reinterpret the Bible using literature that belongs in the same category as the Talmud. Many scholars have attempted to categorize different types of Jewish literature for that very purpose. For instance, in his book Demons, What the Bible Really Says About the Powers of Darkness, Michael Heiser quotes Jeffrey Tegay and says that Jewish sources of the Hellenistic and Talmudic periods elaborate on this picture, indicating that God appointed divine beings to govern the nations on his behalf. Ben Sira paraphrases our passages as follow: in dividing up the peoples of all the world, over every people he appointed a ruler, but the Lord's portion is Israel. The rulers are Ben Sira's equivalent of Deuteronomy's sons of the divine. The book of Daniel, from the same period as Ben Sira, refers them as governors or princes, or in Hebrew, serum, and describes them as angelic patrons and champions of various nations. End quote. Here is unfortunately the problem. Tegay does not define what years or what the Hellenistic or especially the Talmudic periods are. With Tegay's last section saying that the book of Daniel is from the same period as Ben Sira is a clear error. Ben Sira, both the earlier and later alphabets, were written at a much later time in the book of Daniel. Scholars will defend both Tegay and Heiser on this, but we know that some of the later writings of Ben Sira were in fact written after the Babylonian Talmud was. So again, what does Tegay exactly mean here? Because the second alphabet of Ben Sira was written closer to 1000 AD CE and not during the time of Daniel, or during the time of the Babylonian or the Persian exile. Tegay here seems to be making grand generalizations, hoping that gullible people will fall into his broad description in hopes that no one will debunk what he is claiming, and Heiser is feeding off of Tegay's generalizations as well. The first alphabet of Ben Sira, just note, was also written much later than Daniel, like it was written in the intertestamental period, not at the same time that Daniel wrote it. So where exactly is Tegay and Heiser going with this? That's what we don't know. However, Heiser in the same book takes this even further to make a very big error that people are just giving him a pass on. Heiser states that, begin quote, many Many English translations will read according to the number of the sons of Israel in verse 8 in place of according to the number of the sons of God. This difference arises from divergent manuscript readings. The Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrate conclusively that sons of God is the correct reading and that the traditional Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, was altered most likely because of a scribal concern about divine plurality. So this is about Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 8, okay, just so everyone knows. But let me be clear here. Heiser is claiming that the Bible we have been using since before around 1947 to 1956 AD-CE, which is when the Dead Sea Scrolls were all found and collected, that the Bible before then was wrong. Even one word being wrong invalidates the truth and the authority of the text. This contradicts what Jesus says in Matthew 5:18 according to NASB 95. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Jesus' statement of the law here is not just meaning Genesis to Deuteronomy or the Torah, but is a term often used in the Gospels to mean the entirety of the Old Testament. However, even if Jesus did mean the Torah proper, Deuteronomy 32 verse 8, which Heiser and Tegay are trying to say has been wrong for nearly 2,000 years, is part of the Torah proper, which makes Jesus' words even more important. To state that God is not capable of protecting his word from any mischievous person is stating that the God of the Bible is not who the Bible says he is. And Heiser and Tegay are effectively committing heresy here, since to say that the world has been in possession of an incorrect copy of God's word for nearly 2,000 years makes us question the faith that has been validated many times by that very word, the Bible. And the truth that God has given us is now put into doubt. All of this seems like Heiser is trying to claim that the only true form of Christianity is one that accepts his preferred Bible, much like the Sitra Achra churches claim, and all others are wrong and have been wrong through history, which would again mean there has been no church or redeemed image bearers, a topic for later, for nearly 2,000 years. That means that God has effectively abandoned his world if his church, the true image bearers, simply have not existed because the Bible they have has been that they have been using all this time has been wrong. Keeping all this in mind, what does the Babylonian Talmud proper say about any Kabbalistic text at all? In Sanhedrin 75b, paragraph 18, we find the following. I will give the direct bare text first, that is translated by myself, and then I will give the William Davidson translation Talmud, which has additional texts that can be found on Sefaria.org. Here's my translation. Rabbi Hanina and Rabbi Oshaya would sit every Sabbath eve and study the Sefer Yetzirah, and they would create for themselves a third-grown calf and eat it. Okay, so here's the translation from the William Davidson version. The Gemara relates another fact substantiating the statement that the righteous could create a world if they so desired. Rav Hanina and Rav Oshaya would sit every Shabbat eve and engage in the study of Sefer Yetzirah, and a third-born calf, Igla Tilta, would be created for them, and they would eat it in honor of Shabbat. Realize here that the Talmud, which both Heiser and Tegay are using for evidence that the Bible has been wrong for nearly 2,000 years, endorses the use of the Sefer Yetzirah, which I mentioned before is one of the earliest Kabbalistic texts written after the Jewish authorities were once again removed from the land of Judea by a Muslim imam during the time of the Crusades. There are also a couple of Talmud commentaries which refer to the Zohar as well, and a commentary on the Talmud written by Rabbi Yom Tav ben Avraham Esbili, or Ritva, sometime in the years 1238 to 1320 AD or CE. According to Sefaria.org, we have the following text when referring to beard trimming. The text I am translating from is Ritva on Makot. Further, they say in the Tosifta that even with scissors one must be careful because a lower blade destroys like a razor. And they said that the master or teacher, Rabbi Yaakov of Kinor, would tell the barber to be careful according to the Sefer HaZohar that the lower blade should not move. Strange how in a commentary on the Talmud, written sometime in the 13th to 14th centuries, that a comment on how to cut hair references the Zohar, a Kabbalistic Kabbalistic text as authoritative on the subject. This is just one of many examples, but I do not have the time here to go over all of them. But the question remains then, how much Kabbalism is ingrained into the Talmud by both the Talmud itself mentioning the Kabbalah text, the Sefer Yetzirah, and the commentary above mentioning the Sefer Zohar, and showing it to be an authoritative on the matter? How much can the Talmud or any Jewish literature be trusted for legitimate Christian academia and exegesis? The question, of course, is that even the Talmud is not a genuine exegetical source. Since the Talmud itself recognizes the Sefer Yetzirah as an authoritative text, we must also note the overall theme of the podcast here. The Sefer Yetzirah does outline the structure and the Hebrew letters that connect the different levels of the Kabbalistic tree of life. What was developed in later years was the idea of the Sitra Achra, or the other side, which had its own version of the tree of life known as the Klipoth, or the shells. Other than Sephirot, like the tree of life had, which were different levels of the tree of life, the Klipoth described the different Sephirot as shells, which contained evil and everything opposed to the normal working of the world. However, in another Kabbalistic text, there is a mention of the El Achra, or other god. Kabbalistic literature as a whole says that Yahweh is the god of both the tree of life and the Klipoth. But in the text, Megillah Amukot on Torah, in the chapter called Vaishev, a book written in the 16th century by Kabbalist Rabbi Natan Nota Spira, Spira states that, in the secret of wisdom, this dream indicates the 10 Sephirot of the other god, or El Achra, as it is said, Genesis 30, may the Lord add to me another son, meaning a son who will arise to confront Esau, who is the secret of the other god, or El Achra. As it is said, Genesis 29, it is better that I give her to you than to another man. That other man is Esau, just as the first dream showed that the Klipoth are mute calves, all of which entered into holiness in the field, or according to Genesis 27. The smell of the field which the Lord has blessed, the brothers bring the Klipoth into holiness, who stands to receive the Sitra Achra. End quote, and that's my translation of that text. You heard there a direct reference to some other god. As a whole, Spirit does not describe whom this other god is. The Sitra Achra and its Klipoth, however, are the central focus of what is known as the left-hand path, more commonly dubbed as Satanism, where the achieving of your own divinity apart from God or anyone else and becoming a living god or other god is the central point of their occult practices. Since men like Tegay, Heiser, and many other pastors whose teaching I will reveal in this podcast have adopted Kabbalism as acceptable in exegeting the Bible, contrary to biblical commands not to practice the occult, as they will be left outside the kingdom, according to Revelation 22:15, which, quote, outside are the dogs and the sorcerers, end quote. These men and pastors are perfectly okay with validating occult teaching coming from the Kabbalah and saying that God's word is either wrong, as Tegay and Heiser have done, or to just ignore much of its teaching as not applicable to themselves and therefore declare themselves as their own gods in the same way as the left-hand path. In doing so, these men, pastors, and their elders have made their golden child pastors the El Achra of that church, and he is to be followed and not the Bible and not Yahweh. Note the following here from Ein Yaakov, the Glick edition, Sanhedrin, chapter 11, that is translated by myself. Rav Chisda said, anyone who disputes his teacher, it is as if he disputes the divine presence, as it is written, when they contended against the Lord. Rabbi Chama bar Hanina said, anyone who quarrels with his teacher, it is as if he quarrels with the divine presence. As it is written, Numbers 20:13, these are the waters of Meribah, where the children of Israel quarreled with the Lord. Rabbi Nina bar Papa said, anyone who complains against his teacher, it is as if he complains against the divine presence. As it is written, Exodus 16:8, your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord. Rabbi Habayu said, anyone who harbors suspicion against his teacher, it is as if he harbors suspicion against the divine presence. As it is written, Numbers 21:5, the people spoke against God and against Moses. This attitude of disagreeing or disputing with the teacher, as disputing disputing and quarreling with the divine presence, which refers to the Shekinah, an occult version of the indwelling presence of God, which is actually a wife or daughter of Yahweh in Kabbalism, is the same being adopted by the El Achra pastors in self-divination or in their Sitra Achra churches. If you disagree with the El Achra, you disagree with God himself, which makes the El Achra of that church a self-divinizing replacement of the biblical God. You've probably heard the statement, "You shall not lay your hands on God's anointed." It's the same attitude. Do not criticize this pastor. Do not raise your voice up against him because he is God himself. He is God anointed. He is God himself. It's the exact same attitude coming right out of Kabbalism. If you have found this information helpful, I will request that you follow this channel, buy my books linked in the description below, and also subscribe. Hopefully a paid subscription to my podcast blog at the Substack link below. Some of you may recognize my name from a previous blog called Reformed Demonology that was hosted on Substack, which this one obviously is as well. But I decided to start this blog up in order to answer wider questions that Reformed Demonology could not. I had originally shut that blog down because the Sitra Achra Church and their El Achra gods were still using that information to make claims about me that were neither fair nor true. But since they have made these claims, it is now time to respond and respond biblically with what exactly these Sitra Achra churches and their El Achras have done in order to show that the hypocrisy of these men in allowing their pastors to declare themselves as El Achra in the subtle way they have, the way their congregations have accepted the pastors as El Achra, and the hypocrisy of really condemning anyone when they are not willing to be held to account themselves, and especially the El Achra's condemnation of the occult is so hypocritical that action needs to be taken. It is time to stand up and make a stand. Christians or listeners from other spiritual practices, with or on your shields. That saying is something that ancient Greeks said to men going off to war. The shield was a family sign of honor and also a way that one soldier helped to protect the man beside him. While withdrawals could be ordered from their commanders, the soldiers while running were not to drop their shields in order to run faster and be guaranteed to outrun the enemy. It was a sign of dishonor that the soldier had dropped their shield and was no longer useful to that battle. The saying "on your shield" was because the shields were large enough to be used as gurneys for the dead soldier's body to be returned to their families back home in honor. When saying this to Christians, Ephesians 6:16 says to take up the shield of faith. Paul beautifully described our faith in the way of a shield, one that protects us, but that we are to carry and never drop or lose. So hear me say this again. Christians or listeners from other spiritual practice abused by the Sitra Achra and their El Achra, with or on your shields.
Eyes closed, the void unfolds. Whispers rise.